بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. ثم جاء بعض من تأخر عن الخطيب فأخذ من هذا العلم بنصيب. فجمع القاضي عياض كتابا لطيفا سماه الإلماع، وأبو حفص الميانجي جزءا سماه ما لا يسع المحدث جهله، وأمثال ذلك من التصانيف التي اشتهرت وبسطت ليتوفر علمها واختصرت ليتيسر فهمها. Continuing with the discussion of the books prior to Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, the next book that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentions is that of Abu Hafs al-Mayyanishi. Take note that I am pronouncing al-Mayyanishi with a sheen, whereas Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned it with a jim. So we'll come back to this point shortly. Before this he said ثم جاء بعض من تأخر عن الخطيب فأخذ من هذا العلم بنصيب. He mentioned the first scholar, and that was قاضي عياض رحمه الله. فجمع القاضي عياض كتابا لطيفا سماه الإلماع. We discussed about him in the previous lesson. The next scholar is أبو حفص الميانجي جزءا سماه ما لا يسع المحدث جهله. Let us first discuss about the prints of the book. Abu Hafs al-Mayyanishi's book was first printed in Baghdad in the year 1387 Hijri with the tahqiq of Sayyid Subhi. Unfortunately, the manuscript that was used to publish this book was not very good, as it contained many errors. As a result, the print that was published was also riddled with errors, making it ineffective. Then in ثلاث رسائل في علوم الحديث, Ali Hassan Ali Abdul Hamid produced this book again, but he used the same manuscript that was used for the previous copy, and thus the second print also added no value. Subsequently, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah made tahqiq of the book and added this to his خمس رسائل في علوم الحديث. This is the best print of the book. With regards to the author, the full name of the author is Umar ibn Abdul Majid al-Mayyanishi. So remember the name Umar ibn Abdul Majid al-Mayyanishi. I explained that I am pronouncing Mayyanishi with a sheen, whereas Ibn Hajar rahmallah wrote the name with a jim. Sheikh Salman, the son of Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, he researched into this in detail and concluded that the author comes from Mayyanish, which is a place that is in northern Africa, close to Tunisia. Therefore, it will have to be Mayyanishi. Because Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned the name as Mayyaniji with a jim, some commentators assumed that the author is from Azerbaijan, which is in Asia. For example, Ulama al-Munawi rahmallah mentioned in Al-Yawaqit wa Durar, Nisbatun ila Mayyana Baladum bi Azerbaijan, that this is being attributed to Mayyana, which is a suburb of Azerbaijan. Similarly, Mullah Ali Qari rahmallah assumed the same, and he mentioned in his commentary, Baldatum min Azerbaijan ala masirati yawmayn min Maragha wa huwa mu'arrabun Mayyana. Al-Masindi rahmallah also said the same in Im'an an-Naḍar, and the same is further mentioned in Laqtud Durar. This is all incorrect, as these commentators confused Abu Hafs al-Mayyanishi with another person. For instance, Allama Munawi rahmallah, he assumed that Abu Hafs al-Mayyanishi, because of now it being with a jim, so Mayyaniji was Muhammad ibn Ali al-Hamdani. This is inaccurate, because we mentioned earlier that the author's name is Umar ibn Abdul Majid. Consequently, due to thinking that the author is Muhammad al-Hamdani, Allama Munawi rahmallah said that the author is a knowledgeable individual and a great Shafi jurist. وهو أحد الفضلاء المشهورين والفقهاء الشافعية المتورعين، تفقه على القاضي أبي الطيب وكان رفيق الشيخ أبي إسحاق الشيرازي. From this description, one will assume that the author was a great and competent scholar. But this is not the case, as we will discuss and demonstrate shortly. Therefore, in summary, although Ibn Hajar rahmallah wrote the author's name with a jim, the name is actually with a sheen. Then some commentators stated that one may pronounce the name either way, that is with a jim as Mayyanishi or with a sheen. However, this too is incorrect, as Mayyanish and Mayyana are two different places on two different continents. The author hailed from Mayyanish, and hence he can only be attributed to this one place. Now we just mentioned that Alama Munawi rahmallah confused Abu Hafs al-Mayyanishi with another person, and hence he praised him. In contrast, Alama Dhahabi rahimahullah, he knew that the author was Umar ibn Abdul Majid, and he also knew that he was from Mayyanish, but he still praised him. In Tariq al-Islam, Alama Dhahabi rahimahullah takes the correct name, and he calls the author Shaykh al-Haram. He then says, وَكَانَ مُحَدِّثًا مُتْقِنًا صَالِحًا صَنَّفَ جُزْءًا فِي مَا لَا يَسْعُ الْمُحَدِّث جَهْلُهُ. He says that he was a muhaddith, he was so precise, such a pious person, and then he talks about this book which he has written. In Sir A'lam al-Nubala, Alama Dhahabi rahmallah referred to the author as the muhaddith of Makkah, muhaddithu Makkah, Abu Hafs Umar ibn Abdul Majid. Now look here, he says al-Mayyanishi. So he mentioned the name also correctly, and he also mentioned the place to which he is attributed correctly. But Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah, he dismisses all of this by saying, فَهَذَا لَا دَلِيلَ عَلَيْهِ. There is no proof for this. There is no evidence to show that he was such a great individual. Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah then says, فهي منقوصة بما يشهده القارئ في بعض كتبه وفي رسالة هذه من الأغلاط المكشوفة والضعف العلم الظاهر. He mentions this here in his footnotes of the muqaddamah of this book, ما لا يسع المحدث جهله. As we mentioned, it's printed in his Khams Rasail, so it's on page 237. That the claim that he is an expert and an accomplished scholar is nullified with the explicit errors and weak academics that a reader will easily notice when perusing through his books. Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah then says that he also discusses about his incompetence in the footnotes of Qaful Athar, and you may refer to that for the full details. Likewise, Sheikh Awama said that from the books that we know of and the books that are at our disposal, Umar ibn Abdul Majid does not display any expertise. He writes in his footnotes of Tadrib al-Rawi, فَإِنْ كَانَ مؤلفات أخرى تدل على هذا فنعم وإلا فلا والله أعلم. If there are other books of his which unveils his expertise, then this is well and good. But if there are no other books from him, then his proficiency cannot be proven, and Allah Ta'ala knows best. As for the book itself, although Ibn Hajar rahmallah lists the book here, it is possible and in fact almost certain that Ibn Hajar rahmallah did not read the book. The book is filled with so many inaccuracies, with incorrect principles, and with even baseless narrations. Had Ibn Hajar rahmallah read the book, then he would have easily identified these issues and would have never mentioned the book in this introduction. So it is more likely that Ibn Hajar rahmallah just saw the name and he was deluded by that. Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah, he heavily criticized the book. In Qaful Athar and in his introduction to the book that is printed in Khamsa Rasail, he said, وَهُوَ جُزْءٌ جَمُلَ اسْمُهُ وَضَعُفَ مَضْمُونُهُ وَجِسْمُهُ وَالْحَقُّ أَنَّهُ لَوْلَا ذِكْرُ الْحَافِظ ابن حجر له في مقدمة شرح النخبة لما كان له ذكر ولا شأن. The name sounds great, but the contents are weak. The truth is that if Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah did not mention the book in the introduction of Nuzha, then no one would have ever known about this book or even considered it. He then says, وقد أوهم ذكر الحافظ هذا الجزء بعد ذكر كتب الخطيب والقاضي عياض وغيرهما من الأئمة أنه من رتبتها أو من بابتها تحقيقا وضلاعة وإفادة وحسن صناعة، فشوق غفر الله له العلماء والدارسين لهذا الفن إليه، ولكنهم إذا وقفوا عليه لم يروا في مسماه ما يطابق أو يقارب اسمه ولا معناه، فهو ضعيف المادة مختل العيار، تكثر فيه الأخطاء العلمية، ويبدو جليا قصور مؤلفه رحمه الله في هذا الفن. So saying by taking the name of this book along masterpieces like those produced by Ulama Khatib and by Qadi Iyad and others, a person is led to think that this book enjoys the same status as those books, whereas it is so whether it is with the same amount of detail and research, or in the splendid presentation and great benefit that it offers. Ibn Hajar rahmallah, he says that may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive him, that Ibn Hajar rahmallah created an interest in students and those in the science to acquire the book. But when they get their hands on a copy, they are disheartened to find that the contents do not do justice to the name. It has minimal benefit and it is filled with academic errors. So he says that the weakness of the author in the science is very apparent. In the next paragraph, Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah mentions how the book is devoid of any benefit and is filled with fabrications. He says that there is almost no chapter that may be said to be perfect. Furthermore, the order and the chapters are all also mixed up. Then in the following paragraph, Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah explains how it is astonishing that Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned the book here in the introduction, yet he criticizes the author's definition of a sahih narration just a few pages later. He presents the same concern in لمحات من تاريخ السنة وعلوم الحديث. وفات الحافظ ابن حجر في مقدمة شرح النخبة في مصطلح أهل الأثر الإشارة إلى ما كتبه الحافظ ابن عبد البر في علوم المصطلح، وقصر في إغفال ذكره تقصيرا كبيرا، إذ ذكر فيها ما لا يستحق أن يذكر، وهو كتاب ما لا يسع المحدث جهله للميانشي، ولولا ذكر ابن حجر لهذا الجزء لم يعرف ولم يذكر، ووسع كل محدث جهله. So he's saying that Ibn Hajar rahmallah could have mentioned Ibn Abdul Barr, who was such a great scholar. He's saying that it was really deficient that Ibn Hajar rahmallah did not mention him, and then he mentioned someone like this here who is not deserving, and he's saying that had Ibn Hajar rahmallah not mentioned about this book would have never been known, nor would it have ever been mentioned. He's saying that actually the truth is that every muhaddith can be ignorant of what is in this book. Before Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah, Shaykh Mahmud Tahan rahimahullah, he also criticized the book in his treatise Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi wa Atharuhu fi Ulum al-Hadith. On page 472 he said, أما هذا الجزء فيسعنا ويسع كل محدث جهله. He's saying that this small treatise, this pamphlet, it is fine for us, and it is fine for every muhaddith to be ignorant of what comes in it. والذي يقدم لمثل هذا الجزء المختصر بمقدمة بمقدار ثلثه يحشوها بأحاديث ضعيفة وموضوعة بدون ذكر سندها أو التنبيه عليها. He's saying that here in the introduction there are so many narrations which are weak and even fabricated, yet the author did not present the chain, nor did he clarify the status of the narration that it is a fabrication. So he says, وَالْغَرِيبُ مِنَ الْحَافِظِ ابْنِ حَجَرٍ كَيْفَ يَذْكُرُهُ بَيْنَ مَشَاهِيرِ الْمُصَنَّفَاتِ فِي عِلْمِ الْحَدِيثِ. He's saying that it is so strange that Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentions this book alongside important classical books in the science of hadith, which gives the impression that this book too is of that caliber. Yet Ibn Hajar rahmallah does not pass any remark. Because Ibn Hajar rahmallah passed remarks about the books of Allama Ramah Hurmuzi and Imam Hakim rahimahullah. So those books are encyclopedias which are filled with knowledge compared to this pamphlet of Mayyanishi, which has no benefit. Sheikh Rahili echoes the same sentiments in his footnotes, and he says, أما كتاب الميانجي فاسمه أكبر من واقعه. صحيح أنه صاغ شيئا مما لا يسع المحدث جهله في ورقات، إلا أن ما يحتاج إليه المحدث أكبر من ذلك بكثير. Likewise, Sheikh Nuruddin Itr writes in a footnote, لكنها محشوة بما لا طائل منه مما يسع كل محدث جهله. It is filled with information which has no worth, and every student of muhaddith any student of hadith can remain ignorant of it. Since he criticized the books, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah then suggested better options. In between the two paragraphs that were quoted earlier, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah suggests that the introduction that Ibn Abdul Barr rahmallah wrote for At-Tamheed would be a better choice than the book of Mayyanishi. So the introduction of Tamheed is also published in the Khamsa Rasail. In his introduction, when discussing about this introduction of At-Tamheed, At-Tamheed is a commentary of Muwatta Imam Malik. Then the author Ibn Abdul Barr wrote a muqaddamah, an introduction for that. Now Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda is publishing this introduction separately. So in his introduction, he's saying, وقد تلقى الحفاظ الجهابذة من بعد ابن عبد البر مباحث هذه المقدمة بالقبول. That all the great huffaz and stalwarts and expert scholars who came after Ibn Abdul Barr, they accepted all the chapters which he has brought in this introduction. فأكثر النقل عنها في كتب المصطلح. He say very frequently they would quote from this book in their books. كما تراها منتشرة في مقدمة ابن الصلاح وفروعها. You say you will find so many quotations which are scattered in the book of Ibn Salah rahimahullah, and all the affiliated books of Ibn Salah rahimahullah, which we will inshallah discuss in the next lesson. وفي جامع التحصيل للعلاعي وغيره. Likewise, you will find so many quotations in the book جامع التحصيل of Alama Ala'i rahimahullah, etc. So Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah says, وهذا مما يدل على أهمية هذه المقدمة وكونها إحدى المراجع الهامة للمؤلفين في علم المصطلح. He's saying that this here proves that the importance of this muqaddamah, and it is one of the references which scholars would use when writing books in mustalah. But he says then, ومع ذلك فقد أغفل ذكرها الحافظ ابن حجر في عداد المؤلفات في علم المصطلح. He says, in spite of this, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah did not mention such an important book when discussing the important books which were written. حينما تعرض لذلك في فاتحة شرح النخبة له، مع أن أمامه نقولا كثيرة في كتب المصطلح من كلام ابن عبد البر. He's saying that Ibn Hajar didn't mention this in spite of having so many quotations to تذكره هذه المقدمة. He had so many quotations in front of him where scholars are quoting from Ibn Abdul Barr, so that would have reminded him. And then he's saying that Ibn Hajar himself هو نفسه نقل جملة من بحوثها في النكت على كتاب ابن الصلاح. He himself quoted so much from this book in his book which is the nukat of on the muqaddamah of Ibn Salah rahmallah. So he said, فكانت هذه المقدمة أولى وأجدر بالذكر جدا من رسالة الميانشي الصغيرة الحجم الضعيفة العلم القليلة الفائدة بل عديمتها، وهي الرسالة الثالثة من هذه المجموعة, meaning that in his 5 رسائل من قرأها وقف على هزال مضمونها وضألة قيمتها. Saying to make the comparison, you got this muqaddama of Tamheed, and then you have that. If you go read that book of Mayyanishi, you'll find that it has no worth. There's the contents of it are so weak. But if you read this book here, you'll find that there's so great mawad and such pearls in this book. So that's with regards to what is in the book. Now looking and comparing the two individuals, ولا ريب أن الحافظ ابن عبد البر أقدم وأحفظ وأفقه وأعلم من الميانشي بل لا يقارن بينه وبين الميانشي. He's saying that from any aspect, from any angle that you inspect Ibn Abdul Barr, whether it is in terms of the time, or whether it's looking at the memory, whether it's looking at the faqahat and understanding, or whether it's just general knowledge. He's saying Ibn Abdul Barr rahmallah excels in all fronts. And then he's saying that you cannot even create a comparison between Ibn Abdul Barr and Mayyanishi. Is like chalk and cheese. فإغفال الحافظ ابن حجر ذكر هذه المقدمة الحافلة في المصطلح مع ذكر رسالة الميانشي هفوة من عالم. He's saying that this here probably is a mistake from Ibn Hajar, but yes, you could make an excuse إلا يعتذر له. You could say that maybe Ibn Hajar rahmallah, his intent was to write those books which were independently written, because remember this here is the muqaddamah, is the introduction for another book, so it's attached with another book. So إلا يعتذر له أنه أراد ذكر الكتب المستقلة في المصطلح دون ما كتب مقدمة لكتاب آخر. Furthermore, in لمحات من تاريخ السنة وعلوم الحديث, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah says لا يعدل الربع ما كتبه ابن عبد البر في مقدمة التمهيد. أما كيفا, so he's saying look at quantity and quality. So if you're looking at quantity, the book ما ليس المحدث جهله is not even quarter of what Ibn Abdul Barr rahmallah wrote. So whether it is in terms of quantity, then to the book of Ibn Abdul Barr rahmallah, he has a greater quantity. أما كيفا, looking at the quality, فلا يذكر في بشيء في جانب ما دون دونه ابن عبد البر. ثم عبد البر أقدم وأعلم وأوسع وأعظم. So instead of this small book of Mayyanishi, it would have been better for Ibn Hajar rahmallah to mention the introduction of Tamheed that was written by Ibn Abdul Barr rahmallah. Ibn Hajar rahmallah did mention Alama Khatib al-Baghdadi rahmallah. So Ibn Abdul Barr and Alama Khatib rahmallah, they both lived in the same era. Ibn Abdul Barr rahmallah lived in the west, in Spain, and he contributed therein, while Alama Khatib rahmallah lived in the east, and his contributions were in that region. So the two of them, Alama Khatib rahmallah and Ibn Abdul Barr, they lived in the same era, but they did not meet, and the contributions were similar. Thus, it would have been better to mention the work of Ibn Abdul Barr rahimahullah. In Lamahat, Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahimahullah then suggests another book which Ibn Hajar rahimahullah could have mentioned. So he said, وأغفل الحافظ أيضا في سلسلة من كتبوا وألفوا في المصطلح الإمام مجد الدين أبا السعادات مبارك ابن محمد المشهور بابن الأثير, saying that he forgot about the book of Ibn al-Athir rahimahullah. So Ibn al-Athir, he says that he was born in 544 and he passed away in the year 606. So he wrote an introduction to his book جامع الأصول في أحاديث الرسول ما هو أضعاف رسالة الميانشي. It's like triple the size, much more elaborate than a small booklet of Mayyanishi. Sheikh Nuruddin Atri, he also suggests the same book here in his footnotes, and he says that he should have mentioned this here. ففيه بحث جامع لا يستغنى عنه في علوم الحديث. He's saying that in this book you will find things which are indispensable and necessary for when going into the field of علوم الحديث. So after citing these 6 books, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah then alludes to other works by saying وأمثال ذلك من التصانيف التي اشتهرت. So this here you can read it as اشتهرت. You don't have to read it as اشتهرت. And then the next one وبسطت. So ليتوفر علمها. So there were many other books which were written so that this knowledge could be then be spread. واختصرت ليتيسر فهمها. And books were also then written condensed so that it's easy to understand. So he mentions that there were similar books. Now the fact that he is mentioning that there were similar books, this proves that Ibn Hajar rahmallah did not intend to mention the name of all the books until his period. Because indeed there were books such as Qasida al-Gharramiyya by Shahabuddin Ahmad ibn Farah al-Ishbili, likewise Sharh Ilal al-Tirmidhi, etc. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentions that these other books were written in more detail so that the knowledge could spread. And thereafter he says that some were condensed so that it's easier to understand. That one of the objectives of condensing the books was to facilitate easier understanding. So on this point, Allama Qasim rahmallah objected to this. And he said that if a book is to be abridged, then it becomes more difficult to understand. If a book is written in just a few lines, now it's more difficult to understand. So then he explains that the objective of abridging a book is to make it easier to memorize, not to make it easier to understand. So he mentions that أوردت على المصنف رحمه الله تعالى أن الاختصار لتيسير الحفظ لا لتيسير الفهم. That I told the author that books are abridged to make it easier to memorize and not to make it easier to understand. But Ibn Hajar rahmallah then responded and he said, المراد فهم متين لا يزول سريعا فإنها إذا اختصرت سهل حفظها. He's saying that, you know, Yahweh saying that لتيسير الفهم, this is looking at the absolute ultimate goal. So he's saying that the objective is that you have to get a proper and thorough understanding, which will now remain firmly embedded and you won't forget it easily. So he's saying that once it's condensed, so the first step is that it becomes easier to memorize. So he's saying that once it's easier to memorize, وحينئذ سهل فهمها بسبب حفظها. ولا كذلك المبسوطة فإنه إذا وصل إلى الآخر. So he mentions that this here is not the same in the more elaborate books. Now one thing to mention here is that as we go through this book, you will notice many objections of Allama Qasim ibn Qutb rahimahullah that are quoted. A complete book is written with all of these, all of his reviews, and this here is titled Al-Qawl al-Mubtakar ala Sharh Nukhbat al-Fikr. We will inshallah quote extensively from this book. So you will find lots of objections, but we should remember that Allama Qasim rahmallah had a very informal relationship with Ibn Hajar rahmallah. Ibn Hajar rahmallah had an immense amount of love for him, and they were so close that Ibn Hajar rahmallah even bequeathed that after his demise some of his wealth should go to Allama Qasim rahimahullah. What is most interesting is for us to note how sharp the mind of Allama Qasim rahimahullah was. You know, like how he pick up all these subtle points and then he objects. So you will find that some commentators like Mullah al-Qari rahimahullah and Allama al-Qani rahimahullah, they try to respond to most of the objections. So he continuously brings objections. He done an intricate analysis, and he took Ibn Hajar to task for every word which he mentioned. If he mentioned one word out of place, Allama Qasim rahmallah would be very quick. And remember, he's a student, but like we say that he had this informal relationship with the author. So you have these type of commentators like Mullah al-Qari rahimahullah and Allama al-Qani rahimahullah. They try to respond to his objections, but then you will find that there are commentators such as Allama Munawi rahimahullah and others. They mostly agree with what objections he raised. So if you can get this book Al-Qawl al-Mubtakar, then you should try to get it. Maybe if you can't get the hard copy, then maybe even if you get a PDF, almost every objection which is raised in that kitab, inshallah, we will be quoting it as we go through this text. So it's a kitab which will be used side by side as we're going through the text of Ibn Hajar. If there was any remark or any criticism from Allama Qasim rahimahullah, then inshallah we will mention it. Now moving further, Allama Ibn Hajar rahimahullah now discusses about Ibn Salah rahimahullah in his book. Ibn Salah rahimahullah, he he now brought total change to this field. Ibn Hajar rahimahullah explains it, how he discussed so many different terminologies, etc. But Ibn Hajar rahimahullah will mention a flaw in his book, and thereafter he will explain the reason why he still needed to write this book here. So since time is up, we will pause here inshallah, and we will discuss all of that in the next lesson. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi